My name's Khoi Vinh. I work at Adobe, and I'll be moderating today. We've got a great panel here. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves briefly, starting here.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me? Awesome. I'm Adam. I work on this prototyping tool called Form. It lets you design interactions directly on the device, and we were acquired by Google about a year ago.
Hey everyone, I'm Daniel, and I work on Principle, which is another prototyping tool.
Cool. I'm Andrew Pouliot. I'm at Facebook. I work on Origami and our design tools.
I'm Clark from Envision, and I work on Envision, which is a design collaboration platform.
My name is Paul. Whoa, loud. My name is Paul Colton. I was a co-founder of Pixate, and a few months back, we were also acquired by Google.
Yeah, how about that?
Who wants to be acquired by Google? Raise your hand.
So this panel is actually a sequel of sorts to a panel that took place last year at the Form conference. And who was on that panel here? Raise your hand. Okay, great. So I think a good place to start would be to ask those folks, maybe starting with you, Paul, what's changed in the past year for you at Pixate, not just with Google, but what you've seen in the market? And we'll try to get a quick survey of the past 12 months or so.
So besides being acquired, I think really the most obvious thing has been just the tremendous growth, if you will, in the space. There seems to be new tools and being created very rapidly. There's one of those new ones on the panel today. But I think just the adoption of the whole idea, in other words, less convincing that prototyping and getting these ideas down is important, right? A little less convincing now, more about, okay, now start giving me better ways to do it.
Clark, what do you see?
Okay, so Envision, we've been growing very, very rapidly, very aggressively, and we see 3,000 new people join Envision every day. And so I think what's motivating that change is, I think, a shift from the tactical use of design and design tools to a more strategic organizational use. So the people who care about the prototypes that get created are more than just the designers and design teams. I think the whole organization is looking to design for kind of product and strategic leadership.
Andrew?
Yeah, I think it's gone, design prototyping is gone from something that was sort of like a sort of weird particularity of like our design process. So you see like tons and tons of people doing this sort of thing. And the tools have become a lot more mainstream. There's a lot of new, like easier to use tools coming out, and a lot of sort of, I feel like, progress as a whole towards sort of like where we want to get in a few years. So it's generally pretty encouraging, I think.
Daniel, we're going to skip you for a moment. Andrew, can you talk about the past year for Form?
Yes, Andrew. About Form, please. What's been really interesting is when we started working on Form, it was about 2 years ago now. There really just weren't any prototyping tools in the market. Like the only thing that was really close to it was Framer, and they just had like a GitHub repository. There wasn't even Framer Studio out. So we built this tool for kind of like front engineers and designers who were like really tech savvy to prototype these interactions. And now it seems like the market's completely changed. Like I would say the majority of designers now working at startups or these big companies realize that design is dynamic. It's no longer static. They need to think in motion. They need to think in flows. So I think just the market has moved so much from when we first approached it.
Right. And so, Daniel, Principle debuted August? September?
August, yeah.
August. Mm-hmm. So it's actually been a pretty sort of blockbuster couple of months for you. Can you sort of talk about the lead up to launch and what your experience has been?
Yeah, so I started working on Principle a little over a year and a half ago, and when the project started, the design landscape was very different from how it is now, and kind of you already heard what that transition was like.
Right.
So it was kind of frightening to be working on this tool and then see all these other things happening in the same space, but at the same time it was kind of encouraging and a validation to say, okay, maybe this isn't a waste of my time. There's something here. And I was really surprised that, just launching in August, how quickly people picked up on it. I think the market's really excited about tools like this and what it can do for their creativity and being able to express their ideas.
Yeah, you told me a story how you talked to a designer at IDEO who was crying,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Not just because he was a wuss, but because he really liked your product.
Yeah, yeah. He watched the intro video and he said he had tears in his eyes because it was one of the first times that he had seen a tool that was designed specifically for his job, which was a really cool experience.
So the idea of making a product that's a home run with a designer at IDEO is great, but I think one of the interesting things that some of you guys talked about is how the audience has changed in the past year for design, like the customers that you're selling to. Like Envision particularly doesn't necessarily sell to, I'm sure there are plenty of IDEO customers for Envision, but I'm sure there are also folks who would never work at IDEO necessarily.
Sure. Yeah, I think our market, I think what we see, we kind of create these two categories, big D companies and little D companies. So there are companies that have like design as part of their DNA, as part of their brand, as part of their go-to-market strategy, and they're all about design, and they were built with design and design-driven product development practices in mind. And then there are little D companies that are usually shifting to be more design-centric because they're aspirationally big D, like they want all the benefits of design, and they see that potentially their market could be disrupted or with a better player with a better user experience. But they also understand the practical, tactical implications of design and just being design first and how that makes the production process.
So are they always designers, but are they sometimes people in the marketing department, people engineering folks?
So it's the broader question of product design. I think includes the designers, actual people who do things on the screen, and then product managers and project managers, and then the full constellation, like almost concentric circles of stakeholders that are all part of that review, analysis process, and feedback and iteration. Right.
Andrew, Origami, I'm not sure it's exactly fair to say this, but it's one of the more particular tools, like of all the ones represented up here, and it's really targeted at somebody who is a designer, but also has an overlap with engineering. Is that what you see, or is that just my impression from the outside?
Yeah, I think a lot of it came from a place of designers who are definitely thinking sort of in a slightly technical way about gestures, and they want to be very specific about their sort of interactions. Mm-hmm. And I think what's been really interesting is that we're seeing now a lot more people who are not of that technical sort of level join the want to make prototypes and so forth. And when it was just starting out, it was something like you're trying to invent these new kind of interactions, because we were just really exploring what's possible on a touch screen and what kind of interactions do we want to do. I think in the process of building paper, a lot of these things came out where we're really building this gestural system and so forth. Because I feel like a lot of stuff, a couple years ago, 3 years ago, there just wasn't that much of that going on. And we had to sort of start building this from first principles. And so it was very technical. The designers who were involved in those sort of designs, it's very much trying to figure, okay, this velocity here and that, and very much in the nitty-gritty of it.
So the ability to empower your users to create something novel is really central to Origami.
Absolutely. I think that's where it came about, being able to imagine things that just had not been invented.
Right. How about the rest of you? Is that a primary motivation for your particular products, or are you also? I know some products are focused also on getting the basic flow done as quickly as possible. Feel free to jump in if you guys have an opinion on that.
Well, I'll just add. For Pixate, I think for me it was always about, I've mentioned before, kind of really shortening that communications gap, if you will, between design and engineering. I am an engineer. I'd like to be a designer, but I'm not. But that also means I know what the engineering side needs and how difficult it is for that to be delivered from the designer. Right. And so for us, it was not necessarily about what the tool does and all that, but how do we just squeeze that gap ideally down to zero, where whatever the designer's creating, like in every other industry, can be handed directly into engineering without some weird translation.
Right. And I read you actually said something. You said you really want to empower designers to be able to stand their ground or something like that, and almost like trying to level the playing field with engineers.
Yeah, as we talked to a lot of companies when we were Pixate, but that was not long ago, the idea is, there was a lot of, and again, being an engineer, I understand when someone comes in with a design, engineer will say, can't do it, takes too long, forget it, walk away. And there's not a lot you can do as the non-engineer. What we wanted to do is really empower the designer to basically come up with an idea, show it on device, and then show that this is real, right? This is not animation, not a movie, but it's an actual app that's running, and it's doable because it is here on device. And that really, really goes a long way. And we have real stories from people at actual companies that have done this and shown it to their boss, if you will, and said, look, it's doable, I've done it, just get the engineer now to implement it. And anyway, it's very, very empowering in that regard, that there's no more of this go away, you don't know what you're talking about kind of thing.
Right.
Something that I want to touch on, I read this really great interview with this person who runs a hardware studio, and their whole philosophy is they exclusively build their own tools, because the thought process is if you're using the same tools as everyone else, your end product is going to be very similar, and it's hard to create unique things. So that's kind of the approach that I know Form takes, as well as Origami and some other code-based prototyping tools, which is we make almost zero assumptions about what the output is. So you get to fully craft your experience without being like subconsciously guided.
Daniel, how about principle? Where does that fall into the spectrum between empowering people to create something novel and then getting people to express their ideas as quickly as possible?
That's been a balance that I've tried to kind of walk the line on, because, with prototyping being a very new thing, I wanted to make it very approachable to people who maybe this was their first time animating or adding interaction. And so a lot of principles just based on very kind of low-level ideas like layers and keyframes and animations. And you can use those to put together any kind of UI you want. I think going forward, definitely there's a lot more power that can be added there. This was kind of just the good first step that's going to be really useful for the most people.
The approachability, I think, raises an interesting question. It's like some of these tools are very, very quick to learn, and some of them require a lot of investment. And one of the things I've heard is it's very common for a designer who's in the first 5 years or so of his or her career to be able to devote 2 or 3 days or a weekend or even like a holiday to learning a new package. And then there are other scenarios where you're so in the thick of designing and building. I have no idea what that bell was. Designing and building that the sort of burden of learning a new tool is not really non-trivial. Like, how do you guys think about onboarding your users, getting them up to speed as quickly as possible? I mean, what's your ideal, and how far are you from your ideal right now, do you think?
In the context of Facebook, we have this program when new people come in, where we try to give them at least a little bit of introduction to a couple different things. We teach them a little bit of Origami and Framer to sort of point them in the right direction of hey, this is kind of a good idea to incorporate into your practice and so forth. And I've taught the Origami class, and realistically, I think one of the biggest challenges for our specific tool is that being so wide open means that there's a lot of just stuff to learn to do basic stuff in the beginning. And so we have this 3-hour class, and we feel like we're just scratching the surface, that it's sort of something that is really, really deep, because most designers don't come from an engineering or coding background. What's sort of interesting about the very older designers at Facebook is actually a lot of them did come from being able to code stuff up on the web and so forth. So we're faced with this really interesting spectrum of experience coming in. Some people are they've been coding JavaScript on the web, or maybe they even know how to make iPhone apps themselves, and then other people are just know how to use graphic design tools, and that's it. So I think there's immense value in these much more approachable tools, and that approachability. But yeah, we spend a lot of time actually just doing education, because we know that there's a balance of that power and discoverability.
Anybody else on onboarding, learning your tools?
I just said, I think we just want to err on making that as frictionless as possible.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I take the absolute extreme to say that ultimately I'd like to make it that for most people, they never even have to look at a line of code.
Right.
And I'd even say, even into engineering, like unless you're at a low level and you need to be doing that, it'd be great if we could build tools that not only designers could use, but engineers could use for design as well. So point is as easy as possible, as fast as possible.
I think part of the difficulty is, design is becoming so dynamic now, like at Google. When we design products, we're thinking about where, auto, mobile, tablet, VR, desktop. How do you think about that space in like Illustrator? You just can't. And when we teach kind of form workshops at Google, we start approaching the class with that sort of problem to be like, here's landscape now, and you have to be thinking of these things. And when we teach them form, it's kind of masqueraded as a programming language. There's like a lot of logic, there's a lot of numbers, but you need to have a little bit of that knowledge to think about these sort of systems. And the difficulty in designing tools is which concepts do you abstract? Like if you really think about it, like Legos are kind of programming languages. Like the editor is in the same exact environment as what you're building. And you can rearrange things and you can like rapidly iterate. If you want your car to have 6 wheels instead of 4, you can just tack that on. And it's very, very open-ended and it feels playful. So that's kind of what the aspiration for form always was, in that you can build anything, you are programming, but it should feel playful and effortless for this like dynamic design environment that we find ourselves in.
Right. Clark, how about Envision prototyping? I know many people who have sat down, never having used Envision before and gotten up to speed really quickly. That's
They do
something.
cry, it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, for different reasons. No. So Envision is a rapid prototyping tool. The idea is, so there is a certain dimension of the product design conversation that's left in the designer's hands, right? But a much larger percentage of that conversation is in the organization's hands. So if you were to look at product design, I think in 3 dimensions, there's aesthetics, there's interactions, and there's user journey or story, right? So we would put them in probably the reverse order. So the most important thing, the difference between Uber and hailing a cab is a user journey story. It's just the user journey is profoundly different, right? That's afforded by this flattening of that process into the form of a screen, right? And it's enabled by the interaction, right? So when we think about interactions, it's really just a question of how the person moves from state to state in the story. Now, when you talk about advanced interactions, that's just additional vocabulary in the language of interaction, kind of like the kinesthetic layer.
Right.
I don't think I answered your question, but the idea is the most important thing is to nail the story, right?
Yeah.
Eventually, the best companies in the world are product driven,
Yeah.
and the best products in the world understand the user really well and understand how to create that optimal, different, disruptive user journey. Focusing your efforts there, and then getting the broader network of stakeholders to bring in insights and iterate.
Right.
I think that's where we think the goal is.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about the interface that you each present to users. And there's a really radical array or a variety of approaches here. Like, there's some that are very similar to other apps that we've used. Some are very sort of abstract, like, wiring up noodles and patches and so forth. I'll just throw this question to the group. Like, to what extent are we all sort of like moving towards the same kind of interface and just sort of like taking different approaches and trying to iterate our way to like a universal or at least generally understood best practice to describing interactions and animation?
I think while we're all trying to accomplish similar goals, the thing that the interface changes is the way that you think about how you're going about your work. And so when I hear that question, I hear, are we all going to think the same eventually? Or is there value in adapting the way we think to a particular task or each individual? And I think there is value in having tools for different types of people, because maybe you're a very technical designer and you have programming experience, and you can appreciate really getting down and doing some crazy code. Maybe you come from more of just a visual design background, and you just need to see something in order to make it happen. And so, since I don't see people changing to all be the same, I think there's still going to be a variety in the different ways that we create in the future.
Right. Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all in the end a conversation about code. So code often enters the conversation as part of the design process, but there are a lot of people that are just not as comfortable with it. And frankly, the development environments usually for code are so laborious and slow. I mean, I'm an engineer mostly, and a lot of it is just really bad. And so designers just don't want to put up with that kind of interface. They want something that's better. And so, Origami gives you these boxes, and they say on the box, it does this, this, and this. These are the inputs, these are the outputs. And it's just a little bit easier to sort of get your head around than just this textual thing where people often get lost. A lot of where we see people drop off and sort of the framer stuff is they'll hit a syntax error, right? And there's that barrier there. But there's also a lot of barriers in the node-based thing. And I think one of the most powerful sort of interfaces is this visual thing where you see the screen concretely, you click something, you drag it, you can adjust it. And I think there's going to be some mix of these different ways of working where you can't just have this visual thing. You have to be able to add custom behaviors and depth to it to show certain ideas. Certain ideas are not just a box on screen that moves from one place to another. It has to have this certain special behavior where you're pressing, or you can imagine your Apple, you're prototyping peak pop or whatever in Force Touch. You have to actually have that axis there and to be able to see if it's a good idea or not. And on the other hand, to never have this visual representation makes it really hard. If you're just staring at it like code editor, it's so abstract that you spend all of the time changing what's in the text, but not what the user is experiencing. And so as an engineer, you need to care a lot about that. But in a prototype, it doesn't matter what the code looks like. It matters okay, is this idea good or not? Throw it away, move on, right? It's meant to be disposable. So I think we're going to end up with some sort of mixture of all these.
Will Wright, who did The Sims, gave this really interesting talk about how he approaches game design. And he says, the first time someone starts playing The Sims is when they saw the box in the store. They went to the store, they saw the box, and they automatically made assumptions about what the game is and mentally kind of started playing with it. Oh, maybe I'll build a house that's really cool. Goes home, installs the game, starts playing with it. And there's actually two games playing. There's one in your head, which is this is what I want the character to do, and you end up projecting a lot of things like hopes and aspirations onto this arbitrary character. And the second game is the one that's actually presented to you. And that's kind of how I think about design intent. So a designer comes in and they're wouldn't this be the great solution to the problem? Starts visualizing it, maybe sleeps on it, maybe takes a shower, and then goes to a design tool to try to convey that. And as he or she uses the design tool, that mental model in your head ends up changing as well. Very similar to The Sims. So in terms of are we all converging to the same point? I think we're all trying to solve that problem of how do you best convey design intent. And I think right now we're just kind of approaching it from very specific vantage points. Form and Origami are pretty good for if you want novel, unique interactions. Principle tends to be really good at if you're not coming from a programming or engineering background, just conveying those interactions and flows. And I won't list off the other tools, but that seems to be the point. Yeah.
The analogy to the developing games, I think, is an interesting one. Paul, you've talked about that. That there are some parallels here, and in some ways we're maybe reinventing the wheel. I don't know if I'm paraphrasing you properly.
I'm not a game dev, disclosure, but developer. But I think it's really more at the high level about things like asset pipelining and how information, like a modeler will do the model, someone will draw and design the textures and maybe the levels and all of that. And in the game world, they more or less can hand that off directly to the final game. Maybe a version of it, fewer polygons or whatever, but it goes there. And right, a little bit to my earlier point, I think that's what's really missing in this prototyping, quote unquote, area, if you will, is that other than maybe a bitmap, how often have we all either seen directly or done or whatever, where, an animation is delivered to engineering, and the poor person has to go frame by frame, and hopefully your intent is captured by that video. Worse yet, it's a static something, an image. Worse than that, it's a red line. Worse than that, it's verbal. And what I mean by that is like the intent is completely lost, and that is not the case in gaming, more or less, and is absolutely the case right now in what we're seeing in mobile and other, design to dev. So I think we're catching up, that's how I see it, to what they've already had. Not only that, the toolings like Maya and its equivalents are way, way ahead in terms of all of that I just described. So maybe to shorten this up, it's like workflow is what's really missing, I think, is
right.
Like we're solving individual parts. So maybe that's another answer to where we all headed. Maybe it's not what it'll look like, but how it'll affect the workflow. Right now, a lot of us are maybe the exception more of Envision, but very focused on one piece of the workflow.
Right.
I think it needs to expand to include the entire workflow.
Yeah. So how the rest of you guys think about integrating with workflows, integrating with other tools, not just for engineers, but the other kind of tools that designers use today?
Yeah, so we have some like Sketch integration today, and we want to kind of like deepen that because a lot of like visual design starts in Sketch. Sketch is already a great tool for laying out boxes, putting stuff together, and we can go a lot further with that. I think going then and finding ways to like pull in assets, and we have some like if you change something, it'll auto refresh. But then actually when you're talking about production stuff and like how do you engineer things, a lot of it is it's sometimes difficult to understand like what can really transfer and what can't, because if the designer could just write the UI code, they would be doing it. A lot of the time, or especially like I worked on engineering on paper, and we would have these very, very complicated sort of prototypes, but even the prototypes would just sort of show one aspect, another prototype shows another aspect, and then it's the like conversation between the designer and the engineer. We actually figure out how to unify these two potentially conflicting ideas about like the gesture. It's like in this one, if you tap, it does this, but in this one, it's like you swipe, and then it could be ambiguous about what you mean, and it's like that depth of conversation is how the actual like final thing comes into being. So the things that directly just sort of copy paste a prototype into a production environment seem like they're not actually being true to what the designer's intent was, which is to like have all of these sort of these feelings honored in the final thing, and not just literally the code that they sort of wrote implicitly by making the prototype. But there are definitely concrete things that you can pull directly. How bouncy is this? Like, how long does it take to do this? How wide is this element in this screen? Like literally the assets, all that sort of stuff. And right now the tools really suck for that. Like Interface Builder is like an engineering tool that works a bit like the visual design tools like Sketch, but it's very different in its philosophy. And you'll find that there's just not a lot of correspondence when you start to want to make these like gestural animations and so forth. So the engineers are just sort of like writing code from scratch. Like there aren't these like easily reusable pieces to sort of work. And I think part of the future will actually just be the engineering tools getting better so that it's easier to translate good designs into engineering, and less like the engineering tools have to sort of rise to meet the design tools. Because in many ways, design tools are actually ahead. But then engineering tools are much more powerful in other ways.
I mean, to some extent, what we're describing is like establishing like common vocabulary, which we definitely don't have today. Like we're describing like an ease in, an out, or a bounce or something. Every package here uses different terminology. I mean, there might be some overlap, but they're all different. And then you get further, down the pipeline, like the actual concepts in Interface Builder or the functions the engineers call, they're all different. I mean, are we moving towards trying to establish a universal taxonomy or vocabulary to describe these things?
I think both spaces are too rapidly iterating and too rapidly kind of segmenting to ever do that. which is kind of part of our philosophy about design and coding, right, and how those two things intersect, is that we'd like to make a tool that would liberate designers from thinking about code as much as possible, right, to kind of create a higher degree of expressiveness, obviously, and at some point, this thing that you've designed, this thing you've articulated as part of some vision that you had, in your head, needs to be built, right? But let's try to defer kind of the practical reality of this thing coming down into some form of code, as much as possible, so that we can, again, be super loose and be super iterative and lower the cost of change. I think when there is, we just released in beta a product called Envision Insight, which provides some degree of descriptive code from the design, like here are the values, here are the colors, here's an understanding of what the animation, how the animation works, what the timing is, so that designers aren't trying to figure out by watching, or developers aren't trying to figure out by watching and interacting with the interface, but there are actual values there. I think that's, for me, the sweet spot. I think when you try to build code that is intended to be at some degree, production ready, I think you're probably, you'll be constantly chasing the tail of development efforts in all the different frameworks and
I think
there.
terminology is super underrated. It's really, really important to get right, because as a designer, you have that realization that your engineer is the control of your destiny over how well your design actually gets executed. So going as close to them as possible in terms of terminology helps so much. When something's incorrectly implemented, instead of saying, hey, that thing moves a little bit slower, if you're able to converse saying this view has a wrong easing curve, you've just made it so much easier to fix that problem. And if your tools use the same terminology as the production environments do, it makes conversing and iterating on ideas so much easier.
I actually kind of disagree with those approaches, because I view the design engineering disconnect right now as kind of like old telephone switchers. You're trying to make a call, like the designer, you have a task you're trying to accomplish, and in order to accomplish it, you have to defer to the switcher, the engineer, who actually knows kind of the nuts and bolts of the system to make it happen. And so we could still be living with that today and just say, well, we have to teach everyone how to talk to the switchers and the right terminology to use. Or we could get rid of that problem completely by improving the technology. So you can either improve the users or you can improve the technology. And I think over time, we're going to improve the technology and get rid of that disconnect.
Right. And so the opposite of having like a universally understood taxonomy might mean like an end-to-end experience. Like maybe Insight is leading that way towards Envision. And you've talked about Principal probably needing to expand to cover more of the workflow. Is that where you're going with that?
Yeah, it can be kind of a dangerous thing to say, well, we need to do all these things, because you end up with kind of just a monster application, and depending on the type of project you're working on, maybe that's not appropriate, or it's like Photoshop. It's been around forever, and it's grown to just nothing against Photoshop. It's just it's become everything to everyone, and I think if you take that approach, it can be very difficult to maintain and keep everyone happy. Right. And so I think rather than just making one thing that hides everything, we need to kind of start at the foundations and build up so that it's a whole new environment we're all working in. Right.
And go back to the idea of something being purpose-built for this kind of activity.
Right. I think there's an interest, we have interesting sort of debates about this internally, about there's an engineering term for something. Do we teach the designers that term? Do we invent a new term that means something? I think a great example is in Origami, if you want to have 0 to 1 value control the animation between two values, it's called transition, because designers often use it to transition between two things. But engineer, that's LERP. Everyone knows interpolate, right? That's just the technical term. It's been that way for years and years. And to go off in a different direction is always a very explicit sort of choice, where we're sort of optimizing for that learnability for the designer to sort of feel like they're not in math class. But realistically, we're sort of teaching them math, but we have to sort of set aside a lot of these like bad experiences that people had in school, and they're bringing all this sort of baggage to the learning process, and we're trying as much as possible to sort of make it palatable to them, and then that does complicate the conversation with the engineer later, but it's sort of like just so important to get them sort of comfortable in this environment, and with these concepts that are like very complicated, interesting concepts to work with, and anything we can do to like do that is more important than the engineering thing, and the engineers can learn the terminology.
Yeah, I feel like the hardest problem is getting all of this stuff to actually like ship. Like I think the most frustrating part of my day is going on Dribbble and like seeing all this amazing motion design work and interaction design work that just like never ever ever ships. Like, I think it's like very rare that I go on Dribbble and I see something like actually shipped to the App Store, to the Play Store.
That's not really what Dribble's for, though.
Right. It's for like design inspiration, right?
Yeah.
And what's been like a little bit like a problem that I'm like really really interested to solve is there are all these like beautiful interactions conveyed in prototyping tools, and when you bring it to an engineer, you get common responses like, we don't have time to do that, I technically can't do that, this doesn't work with my code base, we're shipping in 2 weeks. How do you make that easier for engineers? How do you make these sort of interactions that you're designing actually make it to production? And in terms of like direct response to a Dribbble comment, it's more about how do you get this like beautiful design inspiration that's being thrown away actually into production environments so consumers can actually use it.
I just want to real brief touch on the common language. I do think there's some aspects of that are very important. Basically, so we can, more low level, what does a certain spring mean? We've talked about a certain curve, just so it's universally understood regardless of platform. But the other thing, using the Dribbble example, wouldn't it be great if you could say, let me extract the interaction out of that amazing thing that was demonstrated, or the motion, or what if that Dribbble image and animation came along with a few downloadable, here's the interaction that I designed, not specific to the elements I used, but just the interaction or the motion or some version of that I could reuse. And I think that's not there today because there is no common ground, right? So if, for example, if they were a prototyping common language, for example, like let's say PNG, as we do with images, if you will, that would go a long way regardless of the tool you want to use. So that's why I think it's very important from all of that.
I want to switch gears for a little bit and talk about sort of the market for these tools. Particularly, I think it's really interesting that, Google acquired two of these companies. Origami is essentially run by Facebook.
Yeah, completely.
Totally fair to say. And I know Apple has a proprietary prototyping tool as well. So it seems like if you own a platform, it seems that it's important enough for you to help define prototyping to actually own a prototyping tool too. And this wasn't the case necessarily before. And so maybe you guys who were lucky enough to be acquired by Google, maybe you can sort of talk about what you see in terms of how important prototyping is to the larger organization, and I've heard a lot of people say why did Google buy you?
I'll just start and you can go. I think it talks back to the workflow issue. I think it's not so much that any one company, if you will, has to own the entire process or we lose. I don't think that's the answer, at least from my perspective. Right? The answer is more about how can we make the whole ecosystem better? How can we improve the entire workflow? Ideally, you'd want to use a product from a company, right, for your entire workflow. But I think it'd be a mistake to say it's all or none. And I think, at least from our perspective, is the way we see it. In other words, can we provide value from the moment in which you drew something on a whiteboard or sheet of paper, all the way into the moment in which the engineer has to push it to their app stores, if you will, right? So where can we fit into that process? Can we fit into all of it? Sure. Do you have to use every piece to be successful? No, because I think it's important that if you have, if you want to use Sketch, but what's something we've built, yet in something someone else has built, you should be able to. And that also talks to the common language and common ground. But I think that's probably the higher level view of this. from my perspective.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything Paul has said, and something to add on is kind of just how far-reaching Google is right now, and how, I've said this before, but how like dynamic design is. So like when you design a Google product, you touch 6 different platforms with different rendering engines and different flows and different patterns and different use cases. And you need to have tools to think in those environments. Like if you're designing for cardboard and VR, like why are you doing red lines? Like answering those kind of questions. And also, Google has this design language now called Material, and it's really, really difficult conveying interactions through movie files. So when we first brought on, chatted with some of the motion teams, and they were using After Effects to convey interactions. And that was a huge stumbling block for everybody, because you would inevitably, you can't really have answers to questions like, what happens when a user dismisses this when this is animating, right? Do you recalculate the animation curve? Like, what do you do? So you need to have these kind of tools to answer those questions and let designers think in these ways.
Yeah. So Clark, you, the market question is a great one for you. You guys raised a lot of money second half of this year. You're independent. What do you see as the future for prototyping and collaboration? And one other thing that I've heard you say is like you believe like standalone animation apps like don't have as long of a horizon as.
If you're looking to sell licenses to individuals, obviously you have to address the question of how big is the market for that, right?
Yeah.
So notwithstanding that answer, I think with Envision. It's about outfitting an organization to be design focused, right? So we look at prototypes as the currency in a broader collaboration economy, right? So if it begins and ends with the designer, I would think from a market standpoint, it's not a super interesting opportunity. Mm-hmm. We're looking for opportunities where we can outfit like 1,000 seats inside of an organization, which we do in many of the places that build the products we all use, because the what happens on this screen question doesn't begin and end in the design team. Right. It starts, in the design team. Inspiration happens, and they're the means to production. They're the people who create new avenues and new directions for things. But ultimately, I think the greatest products in the world are built with a synthesis of domain expertise, strategic understanding, and then the strategy of implementation, right? Kind of coming together at once.
So, how big is your team?
It's me and a couple contractors.
Okay, so you're smaller than some of the other folks.
A little smaller.
So, in the face of like, not necessarily competition, but just sort of being in the market alongside these really big players, folks with thousands of companies of thousands of people, or companies that have raised tons of money. How do you think about Principal's role?
So,
are you looking to get acquired by Google?
I'll answer that later.
Yeah.
With a small team, you can't outwork a big team. You can't outwork Google. But what you can compete on is innovation, hopefully, because you have less pressure to kind of feed the machine and just like we have to give these people something to work on, and maybe there's a deadline or you have to coincide with other launches. A small team has the luxury to kind of try things out and fail without affecting a huge amount of people. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to try to fail a lot and then figure stuff out and share it.
Fair enough. So again, thinking about the market at a macro level, I did this survey of design tools earlier this year, and one of the questions is like, what is your preferred prototyping tool? And the answers that came back were really interesting in that far and away the biggest winner was HTML and CSS. And number 2 was Envision. I don't remember exactly the right, or exactly the percentage. And everything else I believe was like in single digits. So just taking a macro view at that market, what are your comments on that? The fact that people turn to tools that they know and have sort of a generic sort of posture to them. And I mean, what does that mean for the work that you guys have ahead of you?
I mean, I'll just add, this quote I'm sure we've all heard is "Don't bet against the phone" or versions of that. That's how I see it. I think, controversial statement about to come, but the idea is, I think the whole HTML thing. It's kind of the last grasp about what's leaving. Now it'll be a while, but you know what I'm saying. I think it's trying to use what's been there to try to solve what's coming and what's already here, frankly, and that just isn't the answer long term. So it's accessible HTML. You can do it in Notepad. You don't need any special tool. You can do it on paper if you want. I think that's why it's just so ubiquitous. But that will absolutely not solve the problem. Period. So I think that's at least my take, right? Is that's kind of on the way out, and we need to solve for what's coming in.
Yeah, for me, like, this is going to be a really weird analogy with, like, self-driving cars. Like, I feel like if you want any innovation to be adopted at mass, you kind of have to build on top of existing infrastructure that people are already using. So for cars, like, you want your cars to be self-drivable, like, you want to get to your destination without giving too many inputs. You need to build a machine that can parse lanes, that can parse cars that don't drive themselves, parse cyclists, lights, speed bumps, that whole thing, versus approaching the problem of being like, we're going to build whole new roadways, right? Because that's not going to work. It's just not effective. You can't rewire every city in the world to work on this infrastructure. In the same way that, like, when your tool survey showed, HTML, CSS, and Keynote, and like some other tools that weren't primarily used for prototyping, but people have adopted, you kind of need to go to that vantage point and see there are probably a lot of projects ongoing now that will take a year to complete that are using these technologies. And it's very unrealistic for you to go to that team and being like, do you mind dropping all of that? Like, do you mind dropping all your internal frameworks and dropping all your UI kits, all the resources you built over 6 years at this company, and doing it from this, like, whole new perspective that maybe is going to give you 10% more efficiency? Right. It's just such an unrealistic claim. So yeah, you have to approach it from, like, building on top of existing infrastructure.
Right. What about you guys?
I have a hard time believing that people in this room are prototyping with HTML. I think this survey is obviously addressing a broader people who put together products. Right?
Let's take a survey. Like, who here uses HTML, CSS to prototype? Okay, and then let's just go down the line. Form. Principle.
The newcomer.
All right, cool.
Origami. Envision. And Pixate. There you go. So I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Wait, Keynote. How many people use Keynote?
All right.
There's
Framer?
better stuff, y'all.
Anyone for Framer?
A few for Framer. Yep.
Interface Builder? Like Xcode? Right. Illustrator? Photoshop? Whoa! There's like nobody using Photoshop. That's crazy. How about Sketch? Wow. Yeah.
Oh boy.
Well, I think it's because you guys were all invited to go to this conference. I think that you like clearly think a lot about this, and you're at the tools panel.
These are the unicorns.
Like, I'm wondering.
New York market.
I'm wondering.
I've
if you
really
asked the
noticed
investors.
though over we've been doing these origami classes at Facebook for a long time, and more and more, all the designers coming in use Sketch, and that's just the assumption. And even finding like one person in the class that's like a hardcore Photoshop user is just getting.
What percentage of Facebook designers do you think use Sketch over Photoshop?
Like 80 something, 90, and then usually the people that have been there the longest are more likely to use Photoshop. The people who are like learning it now are like, oh, what tool should I use? Well, Sketch looks easier, simpler. The licensing model is more student friendly, and so they just pick that up.
I'd like to get back to the question of like how do you get over like the maybe silent majority of folks who haven't tried these tools or aren't using these tools as their preferred choice for prototyping. What do you guys think?
Download it and try it.
No, in terms of the work that you need to do to change perceptions and to get that first run.
Well, I think there's a lot of there's a weird social stigma that designers should code, and then designers try to learn how to code, and it's like
Big mistake.
really, really hard, and you feel dumb. Like, for just like a random project, I started like using like a Ruby software called Middleman. And even for me as like kind of an engineer, setting up like RVM to do like Ruby version management was like a complete mess, and I felt like a total idiot, and I didn't want to do it anymore. So I'm sure there's a lot of designers out there who want to think dynamically, who want to try our prototyping tools, but it's really intimidating and they feel dumb, and I think that's kind of a huge miss for our industry so far.
Yeah.
I think one thing I'll add is, let's call them the tools of old, which is probably your current tools. They were built in a static world, right? I mean, in non-mobile world. I think what's different about what a lot of us obviously have built, it's interaction first and mobile first. And I think that just fundamentally changed, at least for Pixate, I'll speak for myself, is how we approach the problem and how we built it and what we would want to continue doing. And I think that's fundamentally the difference, right? Whether you know what I'm saying. It's all about motion and interaction. That's why those are the features we focused on first. Not static representation of information. And that's why those features aren't as mature. But I think that's an important distinction. And my point to all that, to answer your question, is you've got to get on board with the new way. You can hold.
You're gonna speak on panels, and you're just gonna tell people,
yeah,
just do it.
Yeah, of course. What I'm saying is you've got to let go of some of that past and embrace the future. And I think if you don't, it's going to leave you behind.
I want to leave some time for questions.
I think on our side, like, we know that thing is really hard to use, and it's just up to us to make the product better. Like, at the end of the day, like, you see other things coming out that are easy to use, but maybe don't have as much power. It's like, how do we cram all the power into something easy to use, or how do we take something really powerful, in our case, and make it like way easier to use? And so that's like the really complicated questions that like I'm trying to work on.
So I want to give a round of applause to the panel, please.